You might have heard stories about the Magdalene Laundries, industrial schools and mother and baby homes.
But what's not so often discussed is how those institutions functioned as part of a much wider system. Mother and baby homes like the one in Tuam have topped the news agenda at various points in recent years. A commission of investigation has been looking into living conditions, death rates and burial practices there and in 17 other similar homes between 1922 and 1988.
I was born in 1942 in the Tuam baby home. I remained there for 5 years and 2 months. I never seen out, ever.
What's emerging from Tuam and the other mother and baby homes is an insight into what's been called Ireland's architecture of containment, a network of interlinked institutions that operated from the 1920s to the 1990s, into which many people, especially women who were considered morally deviant, effectively disappeared.
A series of institutions regulated Irish society for much of the 20th century, and that included reformatory schools, industrial schools, psychiatric hospitals, prisons, mother and baby homes, Magdalene homes. And when you look at the totality of those institutions, about 1% of the population was institutionalised in the early 1950s. An extraordinary number of people were incarcerated.
Through the 1920s and 30s, as the new state bowed to Catholic Church authority, the poorest and most vulnerable and those considered illegitimate were put out of sight into church-run state institutions.
The system institutionalised generations and incarcerated women, in some cases, from birth to death.
I believe I was held against my will. I didn't have any basic human rights. I mean, my name was changed, my hair was cut. I mean, you were dehumanised, defeminised, call it what you like. You were just a non-entity.
Young women considered at moral risk were destined for the Magdalene Laundries. Many were women whose crime was pregnancy out of wedlock. Almost all would have given birth in a mother and baby home. Both sets of institutions were run by nuns.
But it's the mortality rates of infants in the mother and baby homes which speak volumes. In the 1920s, these babies were 5 times more likely to die than legitimate children.
Your welfare was never looked after properly. We were outcasts. When you'd go to town and you'd be walking up the street, someone would say, "Who is the little lad?" "Oh, he's pastor from Tuam." They'd look off that other direction. They didn't want to see you at all.
Of those who survived, thousands were sent to be adopted in the US. A significant number of these adoptions are now recognised as having been illegal.
I've had a great life and I have wonderful parents here in America, that there is a deep sense of loss, and it's very, very deep inside me. As much as my life has been happy and very wonderful, there's a sorrow of not knowing where you came from.
If they weren't adopted or sent to America, the children may have spent several years in a mother and baby home, and then they were likely to be sent to an orphanage or later to an industrial school.
As they grew into teenagers, girls might in turn pass back into the mother and baby homes with so-called illegitimate children of their own, thus ensuring a cycle of generational institutionalisation.
Incredibly, a quarter of those in the laundries came from another institution.
When I left the industrial school anyways, I went to work at an old folks' home in Ennis, County Clare. And whilst I was there, I was a wardsmaid. I was talking to a porter. The next day was Sunday, and I was bundled into this taxi. And I didn't know what was going on, and I was taken to the Magdalene Laundry in Galway. And I cried, and I cried, and I cried. And I knew what the Magdalene Laundry was. It was like a prison.
Some were sent to laundries for what the religious orders perceived to be preventative purposes. But others were placed there by the courts, listed as inmates, and would work long hours without pay or earning a state pension.
I worked all the time, and that was all I did. I worked every day, and never got no recreation, nothing. We worked every single day, we did. We never got one solid penny. Never, not one penny. We never got.
The regimes in the various institutions were different. The Magdalene report into the Magdalene Laundries in 2013 didn't portray the brutal beatings and sexual abuse of the industrial schools. It said that survivors spoke of other types of abuse, of forced labour and of psychological trauma.
Many people who got out of the Magdalene Laundries and the other institutions left Ireland altogether. But here's the thing, some never even left the system.
They told me where my mother was. She was in the laundry in Galway. She was in her 60s, mid-60s, but she looked her 80s. Very, very poor at talking. It took a good few visits before she did speak to me. Anyway, when our first child was born, we brought our grandchild to her and we just handed her to the baby and she grasped the baby and she started rocking it. And the first time that I see her smile was then, yeah, she communicates with the baby. She was, yeah.
The Magdalene report found that most women entered Magdalene Laundries at 17. The records show that the youngest inhabitant was 9 and the oldest was 89.
About 2 cells away from me, there was this very elderly lady, very elderly with grey hair, and she used to cry out at night, "Where's my baby? Where's my baby? They took my baby from me." Can you imagine hearing that when you're 14, nearly 15?
The Magdalene report concluded this all amounted to the outsourcing by the state of large parts of the justice and health systems to the church. That report sparked an apology from Aunt Taoiseach.
The reality is that for 90 years, Ireland subjected these women and their experience to a profound and studied indifference.
The last industrial school closed in 1974. Bertie Ahern apologised for the state's role in 1999.
The last mother and baby home closed in 1996, and that same year the last Magdalene Laundry closed. But a small population of elderly women who'd been in the laundries continued to remain in the care of the religious orders in sheltered accommodation.
For those who did get out of the system, whether they were leaving industrial schools or laundries or mother and baby homes or wherever they were, what happened to them in these places never left them.
Would go outside the door talking for 4 or 5 years. I was so nervous. I was taking so much tablets and I thought I'd cock out. Got all shakes and nerves and everything, and it was all everything was coming back, drawing back at me. It was basically what happened to me in June because the nightmares I was getting and everything, and I suffer a lot already.
For others, the institutionalisation continued. Some ended up in psychiatric hospitals, in prisons, and in institutions for people with intellectual disabilities.
Campaigners and survivors have welcomed state recognition in recent years. But they say the state and the religious orders have yet to truly address their responsibility for creating a system that perpetuated a cycle of abuse for generations.